What if I told you the final WCW video game ever released didn't have a wrestling ring, it didn't have entrances, there were no tag matches or multi-man matches of any kind, and most of it took place in areas akin to a public bathroom? This is the story of WCW Backstage Assault, a game that was born from desperation, released in a death spiral, and remembered as a baffling end to a wrestling franchise. Now, before we get to the bathroom brawls, we have to talk about the journey that got us here with WCW games. Throughout the 1990s, WCW had a mixed legacy with wrestling games. Titles like WCW Wrestling on the NES and Super Brawl Wrestling on the SNES were quite forgettable experiences. But then came WCW vs NWO World Tour and WCW NWO Revenge on the N64. Developed by the Aki Corporation, these games were genre-defining classics that were intuitive, deep, and endlessly fun. But after Revenge's release, WCW's license ended with Aki, and it was picked up immediately by Electronic Arts. Enter WCW Mayhem, released in 1999. It marked the start of a 3-game deal between WCW, EA, and developer Kodiak Interactive. Mayhem introduced impressive production values for the time with real arenas, full commentary by Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan, and even pay-per-view integration. It was also the first WCW game to include backstage environments, though only as a novelty, sort of a fun little side feature added late in the game's development, without much thought really given into it. Despite WCW's declining popularity compared to the WWF, Mayhem sold reasonably well. But for EA, it wasn't enough. As developer Dave Lang revealed to YouTuber Matt McMuscles, EA didn't see the returns they hoped for and quickly began to lose confidence in the license. After Mayhem's release, EA pulled in a new leadership team with a specific mandate to the developers to shake things up. Competing with the WWF SmackDown series that had just launched, or Japan's dominant wrestling games felt impossible. So the decision was made. They wouldn't try to match what others were doing with games, they'd try and do what others couldn't. So that throwaway backstage mode for Mayhem, it ended up becoming the entire basis for their next game, something straight out of a terrible Vince Russo booked storyline. Development of the game began under pressure, with EA giving the team less than a year to make something dramatic. The result, well, was WCW Backstage Assault, a game with no wrestling ring at all that you really couldn't even compare to a wrestling game. Instead, players would fight in one-on-one matches across 14 backstage environments, such as warehouses, boiler rooms, parking garages, and even bathrooms. The ring, the crowd, and entrances were all completely scrapped. But this wasn't just a creative pivot for the developers, it was a complete technical challenge. Pathfinding adjustments, new collision systems, and dynamic environments brought a whole new set of problems to the team that they'd never had to solve before. And all of this, as mentioned, had to be done in under a year. With all of the changes they had to make to the game, graphical fidelity took a hit. Compressed animations ended up making wrestler movements look worse than they had in Mayhem, and really any other wrestling game on the market. Even ECW Hardcore Revolution played and looked better than this game. And the Create a Wrestler system, which was a major part of the game, ate up a lot of available memory on the cartridges and the discs, which forced developers to scale back character models even further than what they already were being done. WCW Backstage Assault was finally released on November 8, 2000 for the PlayStation 1 and December 12, 2000 for the Nintendo 64. And this final game was, well, empty. Despite 14 backstage zones, it felt repetitive and flat out lifeless. There were no entrances, just a quick video with music, no tag matches, no multi-man matches, just hardcore matches and the hardcore challenge mode. And the only stipulation matches that even existed in the game were restricted. First blood matches could only be played with one user, and Human Torch matches, which resulted in you having to light your opponent on fire, were limited to just the truck arena and required 2 players to play it. You couldn't even defend the title you won in the game's main campaign mode. You'd get all the way through to the end, win the title, and that was it. Start over. The wrestlers themselves performed stiff, poorly animated moves, where it felt less like a wrestling game and more like a budget fighting game with wrestlers. And to make matters worse, over 30 of the game's characters were locked behind tedious challenges. But here's the thing, most players didn't stick around long enough to unlock anything. For some reason, those in charge thought it'd be a good idea to put characters like Norman Smiley and Vince Russo and Eric Bischoff behind unlockables, thinking people actually wanted to spend the time to unlock these characters to play as. There were also intergender matches in the game, a rarity in wrestling games at the time, and something that WWE didn't reintroduce until WWE 2K25. So, points for that, I guess. And the controls, to their credit, were pretty easy to learn. Arguably, they were even the best part of the game. But even generally responsive controls can't save a game where there's simply nothing fun to do. When Backstage Assault finally launched on all platforms, it landed with an absolute thud. The critics were harsh right off the get-go, leaving little to no hope for the enjoyment of the fans. CNET gave it a 2 out of 10. IGN gave it a 2 out of 10 on PlayStation, but bumped it up a bit for a 4 out of 10 on N64. Game Informer, a 3 out of 10. And GameSpot somehow thought the game was worth a 5 out of 10. Reviewers for the most part cited the repetitive gameplay, stripped down features, and baffling design decisions as a reason for the low scores, and the lack of a ring made it feel more like a weird brawler than an actual wrestling game. The game ended up selling around 200,000 copies, well below EA's expectations. The WCW brand was fading fast, and the appeal of the license just wasn't there anymore. And despite an apparent leak to the contrary, no PlayStation 2 version was ever planned for the game. EA pulled developer Kodiak off the series entirely, despite the original 3-game contract, pretty much right after work on the game was done. In March 2001, just 3 months after the game hit the N64, Vince McMahon and the WWF purchased WCW. The Monday Night Wars were over, and wrestling's biggest rivalry ended not with a bang, but with a backstage brawl in a bathroom. WCW Backstage Assault would be the last WCW branded video game ever made. There was no final swan song in the ring, there was no passing of the torch. Just a poorly received, poorly designed game that stood as a monument to everything wrong with WCW's final years. EA never made another traditional wrestling game. Kodiak as a studio was completely done a short time later, and the license, well, as of today, if you want to play as any WCW legend, you have to hope that they're included in the game's roster of the next WWE 2K game. WCW Backstage Assault was a game born from desperation and rushed into existence from a throwaway feature. It abandoned the fundamentals of wrestling in a bid to be different, but ended up being infamous for all of the wrong reasons. Thanks for watching.